Yeah, we will be starting. Before we start, we just wanted to make it clear that this session will be recorded. So if you don't wish to be recorded, you can join us on the YouTube live stream. I will put the link in the chat box. So yes. So before we begin, so we have with us Anisa Abeytia, who is the think tank coordinator with the Global Research Network. And myself, Bava, I am a junior fellow at the War, Conflict and Global Migration think tank. So yes, I will pass on to Anisa now.
Thank you everyone for joining us this for me morning. And I know some of you are joining us very, very late in your day, and really appreciate that. So this is our second policy writing workshop. The first workshop we went into kind of the nuts and bolts of writing a policy memo and the components of it. And this time we're going to be focusing on local solutions for systemic change. And I'll go into why we are focusing on local policy solutions. So before we begin, I'm going to go over briefly the structure of policy memos. And there's different ways you can structure them. And depending on who you're writing for, they're going to provide the template that they want. Or if it's for something academic, they'll let you know what template you're going to use. But this is a basic structure that you can follow. So you begin with an executive summary, and you're just going to go over what are the main points of your brief. The introduction. Sometimes the executive summary, they have that come at the very end after the conclusion. Sometimes they have it come before the conclusion. So as I said, this is just a basic structure. The introduction is essentially your roadmap, very, very similar to a thesis or a dissertation or an academic paper, where you're laying out the main topics, a little bit about what your conclusion is going to be. So this is going to indicate to the reader what's inside here. Now these two are very important because you are targeting an audience that is extremely busy and pressed for time and who are inundated by multiple policy memos, policy briefs, and information constantly. So you want this to be really highlight what's unique about what you're presenting. So issue analysis, the next part, you want to then get into analyzing the specific policy or program that you're discussing. And similar to how you would analyze something within a academic paper, but your audience is going to be either the general public, it's going to be NGOs, or it's going to be elected officials, or the any number of city managers or bureaucrats. Next, your method and motivation. This isn't the same as per se when you're writing your method section, like this is going to be qualitative or quantitative or mixed method. That's not what you're going to discuss. A lot of it is your motivation, meaning that why were you drawn to this topic, why this topic is important, or why the reader should think that this topic is something worthy of attention. Your proposed solution. Typically in policy memos and policy briefs, it's one problem, one solution. But as we get into more of our conversation today, we'll see that problems are now being addressed and being called wicked problems, meaning that there's many different components to the problem and different components that are part of the solution. But traditionally, it's been one problem, one solution. And then your recommendations. What do you suggest? It could be further investigation. It could be that there should be a study conducted, or you might have been working in the field with local community members, or and then you can say this is what I saw, and this is what worked, this is what didn't work, and then the limitations. How is this solution, this recommendation, this solution? What are the limitations to it? Do you need community buy-in? Is the budget large? Are there several stakeholders that seem to have different interests? How the interests may not completely overlap. So you do want to mention the limitations, because it does strengthen your policy, your policy memo, because the people reading it will then see this person is an expert. They understand that there are limitations. They know what they are. They've addressed these issues, and now I can consider the recommendations in a stronger light. And then again, lastly, the conclusion, where you just essentially wrap up everything that you were saying. And as I mentioned, in some cases, you go ahead and have the executive summary after that. So before we launch into the second policy writing workshop, there's different approaches you can bring to policy. And one of the things that I noticed when I was working in policy is a lot of times policy does not match with what's happening on the ground, with the problem that needs resolution. There's not a lot of interaction between the people that are actually being impacted by the particular problem. And I'm coming to policy from kind of was an outsider's perspective, because I didn't study political science, I didn't study international law, I didn't study public administration. And they have very, very almost kind of rigid approaches to how you can enact policy, how you write policy. And it's because most of it is going into the city managers and the bureaucratic systems and apparatuses and the way that they function. But as I wanted to begin with this quote, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So when you're thinking about the issues that are relevant and that are important to you, you've spent a significant amount of time researching them, whether you were doing field research or you were conducting literature reviews or whatever it might be. You have a unique understanding of whatever issue, whatever problem that needs to be solved that other people don't. And in bringing that into policy, sometimes the mechanisms that are in place don't really allow for the solutions you want to provide, particularly within the social sciences, with the exception of economics, because economics does dominate policy recommendations. Sociology, anthropology, any of the other social sciences, there's not a real clear way for that type of research to then be bridged over into policy. And that's why I started this series. And it's something that GRN really wants to focus on and help provide tools to researchers and academics in order to make real world impact, where researchers are able to provide their field work, their understanding of what's happening locally on the ground. So there's not this huge disconnect between people's lived experiences and policy. So some key quick questions to consider before you start writing is, one, are you acting as a trustee or as a delegate? So what are these two terms? when city managers or elected officials start to think about and strategizing about how they're going to approach a particular problem, is they think about, am I a trustee or a delegate? And a trustee is someone who uh, isn't representing a specific group or a specific interest. Uh, they're typically elected officials, and they are there to serve all of their constituents. Uh, Commonly, a researcher would be acting more as a delegate. Since you conducted research within a specific population, your research is tending to represent the group that you conducted your research on or with. So typically we're acting in the role as a delegate. So and this can be very powerful, but it also can be a challenge, because when you're approaching a policymaker, they have more than one population to consider. And if you're coming in as a delegate of a specific group, that the needs and interests of that group may not be in line with another group. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to values. But you're going to think about, am I a trustee? Am I a delegate? And that's going to also impact the way you approach your topic. How do you define public interest? It's a very important idea and concept, because when we think about public interest, what does that mean? When I approach policy, is public interest, I particularly work with migrants, immigrants, and refugees. I work with that population because any program that we provide that is specifically has vulnerable populations in mind, typically all the public interest is involved, whether it's food programs and improving infrastructure, public school systems. Everyone benefits from this. But there's some kind of things that you can keep in mind to help you define what your public interest is. One, is it a broad community interest? Is it going to benefit many people in your community, or just one? Many times there are situations, especially with inclusivity, if interests are uh, to bring in one portion of community that wasn't included before. And I'll give you an example from Canada. There was a local swimming pool, and the transgender community wanted to swim, but they did not want to experience body shaming or anyone making negative comments. So they asked if the pool could be closed for a swim hour for them. And so the swimming pool, the community, we said, yes, we can do that. And so that's a way that it's benefiting one portion of the community, but at the same time, the whole community benefits when everyone can use public facilities, when everyone has a space um, in community areas. The next rubric you can use to define public interest is response to complexity and diversity of local communities, as I just mentioned with the transgender community. And what happened after that was that Muslim women saw that, oh, we could have our own swim hour as well. So you now had different communities sharing the pool, sharing space at different times, as you know, one group comes in, one group comes out. So you had not just the transgender community feeling comfortable to ask for time to use the swimming pool, but you also had the Muslim community also being able to use the swimming pool. So by opening up that space for that conversation and for that policy to be expanded, you had diverse local communities benefiting from the same need. And then last, the stakeholder and community involvement. In that example, you see how you had the transgender community and the Muslim community, and the larger community who used the pool, they supported this. You had community involvement, and that's very, very important, because you can write up a wonderful policy memo and very thought out and very researched solutions, but if it's not something the community wants, it's not going to go very far. You need to have that stakeholder and community buy-in, and even better than that, their involvement, if you involve them in the process. So a few trends and concepts to keep in mind when you're breaking down your research into policy is one, complexity. As I mentioned before, before we had the idea that there was one problem, one solution. That's not the case anymore. There's many of our problems, to take something like climate change or migration. These are issues that are very, very pressing and require a multitude of solutions and of stakeholders, community members, scientists, researchers. So you're bringing in a lot more complex ideas in a very limited space. Post-policy memos are not more than 2,500 words. Some of them can be as long as 100 pages, but typically when you're providing a policy memo, it is a brief, succinct, short document. So how are you going to represent that complexity within that small space? As I mentioned, wicked problems. Sweden has an office of wicked problems, and a wicked problem would be something like migration. There's many issues feeding into it, like climate change, colonialism, poverty, war, conflict. So there's many strands that can be brought in, and you have multiple experts providing their solutions. So thinking about problems in that way, they are more challenging. They take longer. They're typically not short-term fixes. And why I really believe academics and researchers, it's very there's a lot that can be accomplished with bringing academics and researchers to discuss these types of wicked problems, because typically social scientists are looking at multiple phenomena as they conduct their research, and they're naturally inclined to not just think about a one-to-one ratio in an idea of a one-to-one ratio, and thinking about problems. Regionalization. Different communities are experiencing problems in different ways. COVID is a prime example. There was a meme that was going around that we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same situation, but we're not in the same boat. Some people are in yachts, other people are in rowboats, and some people are drowning. And when you're working with communities, you have to take into consideration that people have different resources, people have different resiliences, depending on what resources that they have. So, you may not approach a problem in a community, in a neighborhood in Calcutta, as you would in a neighborhood in Los Angeles. There's going to be more resources in a community like Los Angeles. So you have to take that into account. Even though there are still vulnerable populations, we have homeless, we have people who are there's extreme poverty, but again, then you have people that are middle class and wealthy. How do you think about these issues, bringing in and keeping in mind that all of these issues are at play? Collaboration is very essential and key to successful policy writing, the successful implementation of recommendations. It's more challenging, but, and I want to bring in here that in a democracy, you want to have as many people at the table as possible when addressing issues. That way you ensure that as many people in your community can have a say in how some type of issue, maybe a public school or a free lunch program, uh, different communities within one community, they may see something that another community doesn't see because they haven't experienced it, or it's not an issue within their community. So the more collaboration that you have, the more voices that you have, yes, it's difficult, but in liberal democracies, this is what we want to see. We want to have as many people participating. Growth and diversity. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about diversity than growth. And as I had mentioned, with the collaboration, visualization, the diversity, uh, not only just the diversity of people, but diversity of thought. There's not just one way to approach a problem. And it's important to keep in mind, like I had mentioned before, that there typically policy is written by economists and bureaucrats, and they may not have particularly researched or walked with the community, walked with the people that are facing this issue. And that needs to happen, because if we don't understand what the unique needs are, why the problem arose, then we're not going to have a good understanding of how to address it. And that's, whether it's diversity in gender, or in ethnicity, or in religion, or of people coming from different ethnicities, we're all bringing our own expertise. People are experts in the areas that they live. A lot of times we think that somebody who is not considered an expert in a particular field, they don't have a degree, or maybe that's not their job, but we are experts in our own life. And that's where I find the strength of policy is when you bring in different people. They know what's happening in their communities more than a researcher would, more than a politician would. Politicians like to interact with committee members because good politicians do, because then they get an understanding of what's happening within that community. Deteriorating infrastructure. In the United States, this is a huge problem. Our infrastructure is deteriorating, and this plays into a really huge trend that we see, a distrust of national governments, or supranational governments, that they're not addressing issues that are really affecting people's lives. And this is why a lot of the policy issues have shifted to the local. Collapse in public confidence. I'm sure you've seen the huge backlashes against migrants and immigrants, and these populist movements, the election of quasi-authoritarian leaders. Because we have this collapse in public confidence, because policy hasn't been adequately addressing the issues that are really facing people's daily lives. For the United States right now, the taxation system is something that's very that's in the news a lot, because we don't have a progressive taxing system. We used to. Typically, the rich are not taxed, and the middle class is overtaxed. So this breeds kind of a resentment amongst people. And when there's not an outlet for them to discuss this, and when there's not a mechanism for them to correct this, which would be Congress and Senate, because it's not a local issue. You have this backlash and this collapse in public confidence, and is why a lot of policy issues have shifted to the local, where mayors have a lot more say-so in how people are solving their issues, and why you have a rise of research focused on cities and urban areas because of this collapse in public confidence. Technology, as we have more access to the internet and to handheld devices, you have now the burgeoning of a digital commons. Social media influences policy and how people have access or don't have access. Again, COVID has really highlighted how this digital divide is very real, where you have students, whether it's from preschool to university, if they don't have reliable internet access, if they don't have reliable electricity, they're not able to receive an education. So what is the role now of policy in digital policy of social media platforms? Is that going to play at all into your policy? From my research, I look at social inclusion, but not just social inclusion in the sense of being in a physical place, but also digital inclusion. I work for IOC, and one of the things I'll be doing is creating a program for digital inclusion for refugees, because these large NGOs have recognized that having access to handheld devices, to the internet, to this digital commons is something that is extremely important. So also think about how can you or does your policy issue or issues overlap with technology and the digital commons? And lastly, federalism. Federalism essentially is what Americans term the national government. We have the national government and the state, local governments. Is your policy intended to impact national policy? Did national policy, did it not adequately address the local situation? So you're looking at the local, national, and if you're in Europe, a European EU country, the supranational, looking at what the EU is doing. And I'm going to stop there really quickly see if anybody has any questions. Amy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Amy, and my question is directly related to what you're discussing in terms of technology inclusion. I volunteer with homeless people, and I could have told you from a local level what humongous difference it makes for any disadvantaged community to have those handheld devices. However, on a research level, obviously, our fields be considered refugees and homeless people very distinct and different. So my question is, do you see opportunities for collaboration, for building something together interdisciplinarily, I guess, in these fields, especially when technology becomes a concern because it touches on basically everything?
Yes, there, and this is why one of the trends is collaboration, and it's not just collaboration within a community, but it's across communities, not just within one country, but globally. The issues that we're facing are very much systemic, regardless of what country that you're in. And again, COVID has really highlighted how we are all very interconnected, and how a community in Peru may be having similar issues as a community in China. And that, yes, there might be differences, but there's a lot of room for within local communities for collaboration, because as you mentioned, yes, homelessness and refugees and migrants are disadvantaged groups and are facing many similar many similar issues and lack of access to technology and to this digital realm. So yeah, there's a lot of room for collaboration. I'm in migration studies, and by default, it's very interdisciplinary. We encompass all of the social sciences, most of humanities, and some sciences. So one of the missions and goals of the Global Research Network is to invite these collaborations through our think tanks, and through our membership, and through these workshops, to start thinking collaboratively of how can we resolve these very wicked problems. Um, and but if we do not have access to how to write policy, how to think about policy, how to approach um, policymakers and bureaucrats, if you don't have that language, it's very hard to enter into that world. And yes, we do need a lot more collaboration. And one of the problems that comes with that, and we talked about in one of our book talks, the Feral Atlas with Anna Singh, is when you work collaboratively as academics, there's not a lot of funding for it. Working across borders, there's not a lot of funding for it. So these types of workshops, and what GRN was one of our missions and goals, is to be a place where we can start developing those tools and that funding, and those places where we can start having those conversations. Did anybody else have a question? Was there any questions from you too, Bava? Or should I move on now?
Yeah, go ahead, move on, Anisa.
Okay.
I'll come back to it. Thank you.
So how do you analyze and measure policy? So one, you look at the strengths. What are the strengths of your particular solution or solutions? What are the weaknesses? And we're the last policy workshop, which will probably be in September or October, we're going to address this a lot more than we are today. So I just wanted to highlight this. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? You want to indicate both. Where are there opportunities? As Amy had mentioned, are there opportunities for collaboration? More and more, we're seeing that communities want to see collaboration. Particularly, I've seen this trend within EU countries of looking at where there can be collaboration. So where are the opportunities in your work, and what are the challenges? The challenges are different than weaknesses. Weaknesses, as I mentioned, would be something like, okay, we don't have the budget for it. So these are 4 things to keep in mind, and that we will discuss more in depth in the 3rd workshop. So with this question, public policy fulfills community values, and this is really getting into the meat and potatoes of what policy should be doing. In democracies, you look at what are our values. Many times our policies are not in line with our stated values of inclusivity, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these human rights that when people think of the global north, that these values should be and are supposed to be within our laws, within our policies. And many times they're not. And we saw, 2015, 16, 17, with the refugee, so quote unquote crisis, the inability of the global north, the United States, Canada, Australia, European countries to embody human rights and asylum laws and allow people to seek asylum. Most recently, the US Vice President went to Guatemala to tell people from Central America not to come here, even though it is their fundamental human right legally to seek asylum in any country. So we see that policies can move us away from what our values are. And when you come into a community or you're doing research, you would ask, what are the values of this community? Now, those values might be xenophobia, homophobia, but these values are not in line with human rights or liberal democracies. So you have to balance that type of thinking with what are the greater values if there's, you know, if you're living in a country that claims to honor these types of values. What are the needs? Are the needs that there needs to be more access to technology, to handheld devices, to food, to water, to shelter? So you have to identify what are those needs, and how can those needs be met? Policy is very wrapped up in people's hopes for the future. And this, I think for me, this is probably one of the greatest challenges, and why there's been such a backlash against federal governments and this distrust of government, is because people's hopes of the future aren't being met. They're working longer hours, but with fewer benefits. And I did a study with Syrians, asking them why did they come to Europe, and over and over again, this theme that came up was that international law does not apply to them. International law does not apply to people who are not from the global north, and that was very wrapped up in their hopes and their dreams of the future of going to Europe and having a semblance of a life. But even people within and who are born in the global north are seeing reduction in their benefits, good education for their children and themselves, adequate health care. You're not feeling that their governments are in line with what their needs are and what their hopes are for the future. So when addressing policy needs, and this is why when social scientists say all the time, there's this debate between economists and sociologists and anthropologists, where economics advise on this idea that people make rational decisions. They choose based on rationality. But what sociology tells is that people make choices not from a rational place. It can be based on a lot of times on emotions or on your practical experience. And this is why we've seen such a huge backlash against women and minorities and different groups of such as migrants or the homeless, or religious groups that are discriminated against within the global north. So it's an issue that it's an idea to keep in mind. Policies are supposed to make our lives better, are supposed to improve our lives. Opportunities for improvement. So there's many opportunities for policies to improve our livelihoods. So when policy, they should fulfill the values of the community, the needs of the community, the hopes of the community, and provide opportunities for improvement, to be able to identify opportunities for improvement, and to be able to accept that there is something that needs to be improved. So with this, we'll get into the writing prompt. So the first writing prompt: what problems does your research potentially address? Now, this is going to be something that you want to be able to clearly identify what the issue is that needs to be addressed. This would be something akin to your elevator pitch. Maybe it's going to be less than a minute, maybe a minute maximum, because when you're meeting with a potential person that will allow you to make a policy change, you want to be able to very succinctly say, what is it that your research, what your problem identifies, and it makes it easier for that elected official to understand what it is that you're trying to tell them. It's your foot in the door. So for me, I work on online, offline social integration of refugees in Europe. That's my elevator pitch. And then once I say that, there's opportunities to then elaborate on what that is and what that means. Who is the policy audience? Is it local, national, supranational? Or is it not even aimed at a government agency? Is it aimed at a civil society or at an NGO? This is important because this will tell you where either you're going to publish this particular memo, or who you want to send this memo to. How is it going to be disseminated? What is your plan to address these issues? So that's one very key idea that you have to have in mind. Who is my audience? Is it going to be? It can be all three if that's the case. Let's see, I work in integration. Integration can happen at a local level. It can happen at a national level. It can happen at a supranational level. For me, it's aimed at government agencies, but again, at civil society and NGOs because they're part of that process. And here, does your research provide any solutions to the problem or problems? Now, I've geared this workshop towards academics, since we produce very long documents. They're not something, a dissertation or a thesis or even an academic journal article. It's not something that you would send to a public official or even to an NGO or to a civil society. You would want to provide them with something much shorter. So you would look at your research and you would say, okay, what problems does my research identify? And what solutions are there? And for say something like a dissertation or a thesis, you might have multiple policy memos within your document. You might have a constellation of issues that are similar enough that you can address them within one policy memo, but you also might be addressing very, very different things. Like for me, as I'm preparing to write a policy brief about social integration, but in a Scandinavian context, I'm thinking, how much do I want to blend the online and offline? Do I want to write a policy memo where I focus on both, and then a policy memo where I focus on the offline aspect and then the online aspect? That's probably where I'm going to go. So I'm thinking I can address different audiences by having three. And when I think about that, I can break down the different policy memos to address the specific needs, values of a particular community. So for me, I'm looking at Scandinavia. So what are the values that I want to bring into that? What are other issues? So it's to start to think about that strategically. And I like pen and paper, but you can also use a Word document, a Google document, and start putting together like mapping out these are the different solutions. These are the problems that are similar. These are ones that are dissimilar, and then just kind of logging them in that way, so you can kind of have a wider view of what you want to say, what you want to write. And again, remember, you're an expert. A lot of times academics don't want to write non-academic papers or interact with non-academics because they don't feel they have the expertise to. But you very much are poised to be able to inform multiple policy decisions because of the vast research you do within one policy area. And this one would be the longer elevator pitch, where can you explain your policy issues and recommendations in less than 200 words? This would be when you have a sit down, or you're calling to make an appointment with whatever organization or policy politician that you want to impact. You would want to say, this is what I do, this is how I do it, these are my solutions. And many times when I was calling, and you dry call, you don't really know, you don't have a relationship with this office, with the person that's on the other end of the phone, but you do want to do your research and find out who you're going to be talking to. But when you call, this is where you're going to be able to either open or close your network and your potential for collaboration. You want there to be a very, very direct message of essentially, how can you help solve a particular solution? Because policymakers are always looking for people who will help them solve solutions and solve problems, particularly these wicked problems. And you don't want to oversimplify something, but you do want, as an expert, to be able to present your research in a way that's just very clear. It's very clear and simple and laid out for your audience. And I do want to recommend this book, Policymaking in the Public Interest. And it is for bureaucrats, but there's a lot of information there that's very helpful. And I do want to stop again and see if there's any questions from either the Zoom call or the YouTube live stream.
Anisa, I have a question. Yeah, I think I'm coming from a point of view where if you are an early career researcher who's thinking of doing a PhD and who's going to write a PhD proposal, in a practical way, when we approach academia, do you recommend writing a proposal the way you would a policy brief, as in, what is your goal? Are there practical solutions that your research is trying to reach? So would you recommend that? Yeah, I'll just clarify my question once. So I wanted to know if someone as an early career researcher who wants to do research, when they are writing their PhD proposal, should they phrase it in a way that similar to a policy paper, where the prompts that you suggested about what is the issue that you're looking at, are you proposing any solutions? Do you think this is a better way, especially for people who are doing a PhD in the social sciences, to structure their PhD proposal? So yeah,
That's a really good question, because it's going to depend on what your intention is, where your impact is, and even if your institution will allow that. In my department, we have the option to do a thesis or to do an applied project. And an applied project essentially is a policy brief. It's a 50-page document. And it's very much geared for entering the policy world. And the applied project has a deliverable. It has a deliverable. It's a policy memo, and it's about a page and a half. And that's where you kind of condense all of those 50 pages into that little nugget of what would be like 1,500 words. So it's going to depend on you want to do with it afterwards. Because if it is that you want to go more into theory and addressing issues in that way, then it might be more appropriate for you to write a thesis. Mine is kind of a blend of theory and of policy. But again, if your institution doesn't allow for that, then you probably won't get your probably won't pass to get your PhD, because most departments don't. Just my department is very unique in that, because it is very interdisciplinary and very focused on solving issues that are very critical right now, that are affecting people's lives now, and that require solutions. But it's something I think that would be valuable to have a conversation within the social sciences. I personally, when I wrote a thesis for my other masters, I found that I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to just write a thesis. I wanted to write something more geared towards solving a problem. And that's why I chose the program that I'm in, because it allowed me to write that longer document, but focused on policy. And you should go ahead, Amy, and mute yourself.
Thank you. I think exactly on the interdisciplinary point. So because of the funding structure and because what you've previously discussed, that it's quite hard to work it in an interdisciplinary fashion. I was wondering that depending on each of our kind of focus areas or majors, so to say, would you recommend to train our minds on economists, social scientists, behavioral scientists, or would you, perhaps with your background in creative writing, would you also consider something like science fiction of N.K. Jemisin, who's like doing great work on environmental science and environmental science fiction, or Kim Stanley Robinson, or folks like that who appear to be fiction writers, but they are grappling with very pertinent problems from a science fiction or fiction way?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought in the arts, because the arts play a pivotal role in how we see the world. And it's something that I address in my policy brief. In the world is really changing quite rapidly, and we're facing these really huge problems. And how is it that we are going to wrap our heads around solutions to problems we've never had before? And that's another aspect of wicked problems we did not have before: water scarcity, climate change, refugees. There's large influx of refugees. How are we going to think about that? And I bring the example of mathematics. When scientists envision something new, a new way of understanding or a new formula, etc., how do they explain these new things to people, to their colleagues, when no one's ever seen it before? How do you describe relativity when no one's ever seen something like that before? They use numbers, they use math. And I believe within the social realm, we use art. Art is a wonderful way to invite many people into problem solving, whether it be fiction, whether it be music, or visual, the various forms of visual arts, even dance. I mean, because people are affected by art in different ways. Some prefer literature, some prefer music, some prefer the visual. But as you mentioned, these artists can be catalysts to having these public discussions. And this is why the GRN, we do have artists in residence that we collaborate with, to think about how can we have these creative solutions to problems we've never seen. In July, I believe, Bava, correct me if I'm wrong, the think tank on war, conflict, and global migration are going to be having a discussion about art and conflict and war and global migration, and bringing those two things together. So yeah, I really do believe arts can help with that, and with the interdisciplinary aspect. I use my own creative writing microfiction to highlight my research that I've done with refugees. So, people may not have themselves been a refugee, but they may have experienced loss, suffered, pain. These are all very human emotions. And one of the things that policy where you can overlap this is um, sharing your story in a way that a policymaker can understand. And one of the examples I gave last time, I went to a meeting one time, and they didn't tell me that I would be meeting with the Secretary of Homeland Security. And 15 minutes before, they said, "Okay, you're going to speak to him." And I said, "Fine, I have these three asks that I want." And as I was listening to him talk, he talked a lot about movies and TV programs. I said, "This person really loves film. How can I use that as a hook, as a way into getting him to understand that um, understand my asks and why they're important, why my solutions are important." And so I had asked him, I said, "Have you ever seen the movie Terminal with Tom Hanks?" And I said, "Yeah, where he's stuck in the airport." He said, "Yeah." He's like, "I've seen that movie, yeah, with Tom Hanks." I said, "That's right now the people who need temporary protective status. They're stuck. They can't work. They can't open a bank account. They can't go to school. They can't rent. We need to give them temporary protective status so that they're not in a situation like Tom Hanks in the movie, The Terminal." So that was one way that you can bring in arts. When there's a film, people can have a better understanding of why this particular issue is relevant. And artists can grapple with social problems, social conflicts, social phenomena in a much more agile way than a policymaker can, because there's more freedom. There's more freedom there. And I mentioned before Anna Singh and Feral Atlas. Uh, this is essentially what she's doing she's co-authored a digital book, and it's available to the general public. And they used art and these curated spaces in their digital book, where you're invited into a space that's been curated for you to be able to enter these very scary topics about mass extinction and erosion of resources in a way that you want to engage, where you're not frightened away or petrified into inaction. Questions right now, I am going to just talk really briefly about why I think this type of policy writing is needed at this time. As I mentioned, this is a different approach to policy writing, thinking about the public good, the public interest, values, democracy. We're kind of at this pivotal point right now in our history, where we have to decide if we want to implement our values, our democratic values within our social structure. They're being eroded. Our human rights are being eroded. And when we use policy to be an inclusive exercise, when we work collaboratively, when we work across borders, because we didn't enter this world that we have now just perchance. It was by design. A lot of the issues that we're facing came out of colonialism and the policies and the laws that were written during that time. This whole migration crisis is because we're coming out of that time, of that system. And there's a quote here that I wanted to leave you with and to have you think about. the best way to predict the future is to create it. When we think about policy, we're designing the way in which we want to live within our communities. We're designing the way we want resources to be allocated. We're designing the way in which we want to treat each other. And it's my hope that by having these conversations with as many people within our community as possible, we'll become more inclusive, which will make us more democratic. And when we work at the local level, it's easier to get to know people within our communities. And when we don't have this exchange of ideas with people within our own communities, it's easier to have these kinds of backlashes that we're seeing across Europe and across the United States and even across Canada now. That's more visible. People want to be heard. People want to be included. It's a fundamental need. And when we don't address people's needs, when we don't address those values and all the list of the trends that I discussed, we move further and further and further away from democratic systems. And I, for one, want to live within a society where I'm welcomed fully, not just tolerated and not just seen as, and I don't have to just be one thing. I can express myself as with every aspect that is me. And policy is a wonderful way to do that. And as you mentioned, art is a wonderful catalyst for helping us understand and address these issues. And if nobody has any other questions, please do keep in mind that the next workshop will be in, I believe in October, probably on the 15th at the same time as now. So we will see that and see you then. And I'm not sure if Amy has another question or if
yeah, sorry.
No problem, please.
I think now that I think about the both how to create empathy and how to tailor our messages as academics and advisors to create policy, I'm struck by the idea that a lot of kind of technocratic leadership is increasingly moving towards something that is more data focused and data driven rather than data informed, which means that they have a very ambiguous relationship to what we call big data. And I do wonder how you see changing the policy or even the advisors and the academics' roles while this new sort of evidence is available in abundance and maybe not filtered.
Or filtered in a way that's nothing. There was a study done a number of years ago out of Stanford with coding, and they could tell if a woman or a man coded something. So we're always influencing things. There's nothing that humans touch that does not reflect whatever values that they have. Even coding, you can tell if it's a male or a female. So with this big data, it kind of goes again to this, the debate over qualitative or quantitative, anthropology, sociology, or economics. Are we just going to use numbers? Numbers are great, but they don't tell the complete story. They tell, depending on how you ask the question, how you compile the data, really skews our understanding of what that data is saying. And that's why I always use a component of storytelling, of that gathering the larger stories to inform what that data is saying. And the further we move away from that, and I think this is why there is disconnect between policies and with what's happening in reality is because these numbers aren't being informed by real people's lived experiences, and why I focus on local and on local initiatives and local communities and local stakeholders, because this is where the stories are being gathered. This is where policy is being implemented, is at the local level. So if you do not bring in these local voices, your national policies are not going to reflect or be implemented within these local communities. And that's what we saw, this rupture between supranational, national, and local during the refugee influx in 2015, where local communities were left to absorb hundreds of people. When I traveled to Norway, I mean, that's what I saw, and across Scandinavia, across Europe, local communities had to come together and say, okay, how are we going to bring these people into our community? What services do they need? How can I be part of that solution? So I think really it is going to be continually to focus on these local initiatives, so that we don't lose the story in the numbers. Anna, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, my question is a bit more in a practical term. If I were to write a document or an informative document that's not based on my research, but in several researches, like for instance, why do prisoners have to be prioritized for vaccination? And would a policy memo be the right document to use, or which? Because the structure you mentioned relies a lot on using your own research. And then I was wondering if I'm relying on other people's researches to create a case, then what would be the best option?
Good question. I focus more on research and field research, but I also mentioned literature review. Wherever it is that you're deriving your information from, that's valid form of basing a policy memo on. So if you have sources, and it's not really a literature review, but there's an aspect to the policy memo, and I have written policy memos where I break down what am I basing my research on, because my policy memo on. Because it could be, in part by my research, but it also is in part that I've, read this study, or I read this other study, I read this book. So you can, feel free to do that as well. It's very, very valid. You can use other experts within the field that you're looking at. And another class we're going to do either in December or January is non-academic writing for academics, or another good place for writing this would be an opinion piece, which is also kind of a policy document, because you're outlining what you would like to do. I wrote one where I attended a talk by a former ambassador, and he's an expert in his field. He's very well respected. And he was essentially saying the same thing that I was. But because he's a more senior expert, I looked at combining what he was saying with what I had written. And I published it that way, that here's this is what he said. This is why it's in line with what I'm saying. This is why it's important. He implemented this specific program in these specific countries, and this was the outcome. And this is a program I would like to expand to other countries in the region. So that's how I did that. So yeah, more than valid. And you would just, instead of saying it was your, when you read in the introduction, you would introduce it that you would introduce who the experts are, and why why what they're saying is valid, and that's when you would go into further in the document. You would look at. So the executives, the issue analysis, this is where you would really talk about the sources that you used instead of putting in your field research and your method and your motivation here, why looking at these expert documents are important, and what are the solutions that they are proposing. But does that answer your question, Anna? And are there any other questions? So with that, if there are no other questions, I'm going to thank everybody for attending, and I hope that this was useful for you. And please follow the GRN. Follow the GRN so you can be updated as to when our next policy workshop is, and also the Bava. Could you tell us a little bit more about the art event we're having next July?
Hi, yes. So we are having an event on 16 July, and it's going to be a conflict tree mapping exercise. So it's an idea of people, it's an interactive art sharing event, followed by the conflict tree mapping exercise. We are doing it in collaboration with People Beyond Borders. So it'll be a very interesting opportunity for researchers who are interested in engaging with NGOs in their work as well. So please do follow the GRN website when the link to the event is made available. And the first part of the event will be the conflict tree mapping exercise, where we hope people will join and interact in understanding their own internal conflicts. And then we will move on to an art sharing event where we invite people to share according to some prompts that we will generate and send beforehand to those who have registered. So please do keep a lookout on the GRN website for the link to register so that we can keep you on the loop. Thank you.
Anna, did you have another question, or let's see your hand raised? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, and hopefully we see you next time for our third session.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.